Testing, testing. Okay, is that loud enough? Yes? Excellent. All right, is it 9:30? Are we good to go? 1 minute? All right, I'll give you guys 1 minute. Good morning, Hudson. You have some beer for me there? Make sure you don't miss Hudson's talk about the cat herders today, right? 1:15.
On peut essayer. Le seul truc, c'est que j'ai peur de débrancher ça, en fait, et que ça fonctionne plus après le clicker.
All right, I'm going to kick off. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour. Thanks for being here for the first talk. I know many of you are probably as jet-lagged and sleepy as I am right now, so maybe we should all get up and some badger dancing or something. No, I'm joking. Cool. So I'm Lane. I am a core developer on the EWASM team, but I'm not here to talk about EWASM or about code, really. I'm here to talk about kind of the social side of Ethereum. So a couple of things just kicking off. The first is that I want to confess that I feel like completely unqualified to be up here talking about this stuff, okay? I'm not a social scientist. I don't have a degree in sociology or philosophy or history or any of these topics. I'm just a hacker who believes that what we're building has a potential to have a huge impact on the world. And so what that means to me is I'm going to make mistakes, okay? I'm going to leave things out. I'm going to get things wrong. And so when that happens, please be nice. Feel free to point them out. I'll try to save a few minutes for Q&A at the end. There's also a forum which I'll point out where we can continue this conversation. And again, you know, I'm just one person talking about this stuff because I care a lot about it, but this is very much a community effort. It should be, right? I'll share this Etherion.org in a moment. So please join that conversation. Like I said, point out things that I've missed. Help us improve this message. The second thing is to kind of manage expectations a little bit. I know the topic, the title here may be a little confusing. This is not about social impact, okay? I'm not here to give you a feel-good talk, to talk about banking the unbanked or unbanking the banked or whatever version of that you prefer, to talk about saving refugees. This is like a super big picture, long-term talk about massive mega political trends in the world. So instead of being like a feel-good talk, this is actually kind of the opposite, right? It's kind of a talk laying out how much work we have cut out for us. So let's go ahead and dive in. This is an Ethereum conference, so you're going to hear me talk about Ethereum a lot, right? Use that word a lot in the next 30 minutes. But I want to be very clear, this is not specifically about Ethereum. This is bigger than Ethereum. And so feel free to mentally replace the word Ethereum with your favorite generic word, whether that's Web3 or crypto or blockchain or whatever, or even another project. I don't care, as long as it's decentralized, right? I think the topics that I'm going to talk about require a platform like Ethereum that has sovereign-grade censorship resistance. So let's start from the beginning, right? We have this amazing Ethereum community that has grown and exploded over the past year. I feel quite privileged and quite lucky to have been a part of this community for about 18 months now. We're all members of this community in one fashion or another. As Hudson can attest, we have completely failed to define the community, right? So we kind of try to be as broad and inclusive as we can be. So we're all part of this community. But you know, some interesting things have happened. So over the past few months, I've attended a bunch of events that I thought are quite interesting, right? So this is an image from the Web3 Summit that was hosted in Berlin in the autumn. This is a gentleman named Harry Halpin delivering a talk on lessons that the Web3 ecosystem can learn from the Web2 ecosystem, things like avoiding capture by big companies. This is also from the Web3 Summit. This is what's called a node, right? So they actually had a very large space reserved at the Web3 Summit for kind of self-organized groups to develop their own agendas and deliver their own content. So this was a decentral node organized by the Giveth team. Props to Giveth if anyone from Giveth is in the room. And so they talked about all things decentralized. I believe this particular talk here is about decentralized governance. This is truly a conference within a conference. That was really exciting. Check out the Web3 Summit. I know it's happening again this year. This is the legendary Andy Tudhope from the Status team. speaking at an event that was the Ethereum Philosophers Salon, right? So this was held at the Status Hackathon in Prague just before DevCon last year. And the things that the people in this room were sharing, I found it quite powerful, right? Again, it's not about technology. These are people talking about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, kind of our purpose, right? Why are we all here? What are we building? Who are we building it for? This is a Status town hall, which was also held at the Status Hackathon. And this is a room full of people, team members, community members, again, not talking about technology specifically, brought together by Ethereum. But so this particular talk is Exiled Surfer here on the floor talking about vulnerability and how that factors into his work, into the community and the values. This is a breakout session at DevCon last year in Prague on diversity and inclusion. Really awesome session to be a part of. We talked about how to recruit more diverse backgrounds, people from more diverse backgrounds, more diverse opinions into our space to build products for people who are very different than we are. So the point I'm kind of trying to make with all of these images and these kind of little stories is that while Ethereum is what brought us together, we've grown, right? And so as a community, our community stands for a lot more than just great technology. Although the technology, of course, is what we talk about the most, we're most comfortable talking about. So I gave a talk at DevCon introducing my version of what it means to be an Etherean. This is a word that you've seen used on and off for years in different contexts. So just kind of trying to define what this is, right? And I realized as I was preparing and giving this talk last year that identity is complex, multi-layered. Identify as a software developer, identify as a blockchain core developer, identify as an American and a New Yorker, et cetera. But actually, one of the strongest components of my identity is this Ethereum identity. So we kicked off a dialogue in October about what that means to everybody, right? Is Ethereum a social movement? Is it a political movement? Are we philosophers? Are we just a support group for people who share some of the same fears and hopes and issues? It's sort of all of these things and none of these things at the same time. So yeah, as I said, I ask you all to kind of pause and reflect a little bit. Like, does this identity mean anything to you? And if it does, like, what does it mean? So one definition of Ethereum is simply an explicit recognition of the fact that our movement is about a lot more than technology, as I said. We launched this Ethereum.org website and forum at DevCon as well. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out yet, please do. Plug in Ethereum.org into your web browser. It's at the moment, it's just a discourse forum, but we hope to grow it into a lot more, right? So one thing I intend to do is to start publishing some articles here to add some sort of content management platform to it. Again, this is completely community driven. Everyone is free to join this community, contribute to it, help us figure out what to do with this domain and with this website and with this community. There's been some really engaging conversations here. We've talked about topics like what is a nation state, which I'll talk about more today. What is an Ethereum? Is that the right name for the movement? Another one of my favorites here is a Web3 Bill of Rights, very exciting topic. I was not around then, but I've been told that this forum resembles kind of what Bitcoin or Bitcoin Talk looked like 6-7 years ago, kind of very early on. So kind of very idealistic, big picture thinking and conversations. There was an Ethereum meetup at ETH Denver, which I missed, unfortunately, but we're also doing an Ethereum meetup here tomorrow night. I'll share more information on that in a moment if you're interested in joining. Another way of looking at it is the following. So governing blockchains is a really hard problem, right? As many of you know, there's a lot of very smart people who have very strong opinions about this. Do we want on-chain or off-chain government? Do we want immutability? Do we want more flexibility? I'm not going to talk about any of those things today. I'm turning it around, right? And the question that I'm asking and the topic that I'm addressing is, what can we use Web3 and blockchain, censorship-resistant, decentralized platforms to govern, right? What role do they have to play in helping us envision and build a better future? This is sort of another version of what Ethereum means to me. So we have these things called institutions, right? And institutions can be things that are relatively concrete, like banks, like a physical bank that you walk into. and transact with. It can be something a bit more abstract, like a legal system, a court system. It can be something as large as a nation state. It can also be something extremely abstract, like the institution of marriage, right? And the way I like to think about institutions is that they're like the furniture in the room. Okay, so imagine that you walk into a room like this or a hotel room or something, and things are kind of configured in a certain way, right? There's sort of a table and chairs over here, there's a desk over here, there's a lamp over here, and you didn't put them there, right? And we kind of move around in this space, right? And our movements are somewhat prescribed by the type of furniture, the type of institutions that are around us. But it's very rare that we stop and ask these hard questions, right? Like, why are they configured the way they are? Why is this table over here? Why does it look like this? Why is it this shape or this color? Who put it there? And is this the best possible table, okay? So the way one lens that I use when I look at the world, I find very useful, is this lens of institution, right? Which is a big, powerful lens which helps us understand, for example, why some countries, some cultures, some societies have done better than others, why some are wealthier than others. My favorite example of an institution is the nation state, okay? It's sort of the biggest, most obvious example. And we have all grown up in a world where when you look at this world map, it looks complete, right? There's these neat shapes and colors, and everything is filled in. There's not really any blank space aside from Antarctica. There's big, bold lines drawn around these nation states. And it's sort of possible, you sort of feel like this system is perfect and complete, right? And so as I was saying about the furniture before, have you actually stopped to think, like, is this the ideal? Is this the best possible system? Why are things this way? So actually, nation states it's a pretty young system. You know, throughout all of human history, we've had lots of other configurations, right? We had, you know, immediately before nation states, we had kingdoms, we had empires. We had, you know, much more complex configurations of principalities and duchies and all these kind of, like, you know, random political configurations. The nation-state system was born around 400 years ago here in Europe. This is an image from the Treaties of Westphalia, which was a series of peace treaties that were intended to end some religious wars that had dragged on for decades in Western Europe. And this was the very first time in history that people got together and articulated for the first time, what is this idea of a sovereign nation state, right? Because up to that point, that concept never existed. So again, just making the point, right? This is actually a relatively young technology, and all technologies arise in a particular place and a particular time as a result of a particular set of circumstances, and eventually fade away and become obsolete and become replaced by something else. So this is what Germany looked like at the time. Okay, this goes back to what I said, right? I find this map fascinating. I could stare at this for hours as a geography nerd. It's hundreds of little, you know, counties and principalities and duchies and all these other words I've never even heard of before. So of course, when I say Germany, like, that's a modern idea. Germany is a nation state today, but like, it wasn't until pretty recently. And it's a bit of an extreme example, right? You can see there's a kingdom of France and a kingdom of Poland and others around it. And so this is Germany today, right? So again, we're back to these kind of, you know, bold lines and clean colors, and again, the kind of map looks complete and looks perfect. But if we zoom in, we see things like this. I don't know if we have any Belgian or Dutch people in the room, but this is a portion of the border between the Netherlands and Belgium, an area called Barl-Hertog. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. And actually, like, that kind of looks like that to me, right? So the point I'm making is these clean abstractions, like the nation state, when you really zoom in, you see stuff like this. And this is just one random example. There are examples of this all over the world. Okay, and to me, this is where, again, like, this abstraction, this clean abstraction of a nation state, like, really starts to break down. This particular example, these countries are both in the EU. And so actually, like, this is not as interesting as an example like this, okay? So this is Afghanistan, Pakistan. Again, we've grown up in a world where these are countries, right? They have flags, they have prime ministers and presidents, they have national anthems, right? They check all the boxes. Except, you know, when you kind of zoom out, you realize the reality is much more complex and messy than that, right? So each of these colored blobs represents an ethno-linguistic group, a sort of cohesive group of people who share a common identity, right? And right through the middle, we have this thing called the Durand Line, this big black line. Does anyone know who Durand was? So Durand was a British diplomat, okay, a Westerner who in 1893 was commissioned by the British government, by the king, to draw this line and divide this up into countries. And trust me, when he did this, it was not to like satisfy the locals, okay? This was clearly executing like British political aims in the region at that point in time. And again, there are examples of this all over the world, right? And so the point I'm making by showing a map like this, I think again, we can learn a lot from maps, right? Is that for millions of people, probably for tens or hundreds of millions of people, populations around the world, this system has never worked for them, okay? They've never been enfranchised by this concept of a nation state. So I just want to drive the point home that it's not a perfect and it's not a complete system. It never has been for many people. And to think naively that this system that we have now is sort of the perfect or the best system, the ideal system, I think is very naive. So the nation state is struggling in some ways. I would go so far as to say that I think the nation state system is beginning to fall apart. It's beginning to die. And there are many, many, many concrete examples that we could go into. We don't have time to drill down into them today, but we can look at, you know, the unrest that's happening right here in Paris. This is a great place to be having this conversation. We can look at populism and what's happening in places like the Philippines, Brazil, the United States. I think Brexit's another great example of this. That may sound like a bold statement, right, to say nation states are dying or on their way out at a time when they're stronger than they've ever been before, right? We were moving into this bipolar world with the United States and China. Of course, Europe is significant as well. But you know, if you don't believe me, if you're skeptical about this topic, there's a book called Sovereign Individual, which I highly recommend you read. It sort of makes this case more strongly than I could. And in a nutshell, what it boils down to is that these large nation states arose, again, because of a particular configuration of what are called macro-political trends at a particular point in time in human history. And in particular, it's the returns to scale, to large scale and to large use of violence, right, that caused nation states to grow and become so strong. It made a lot of sense for a few hundred years for countries to get very, very big and have large populations so that they could field very large armies to dominate and gather more resources for themselves. But that trend has begun to reverse in a big way. And that's because of things like microcomputing. It's because of things like encryption, tools like the tools that we're building, as well as things like guerrilla warfare. Okay? And so these large trends cannot be stopped. They cannot be reversed. So the question becomes, if you buy that nation states will not exist in their present form forever, right? The question becomes, what replaces them? Okay? I'm a big fan of Black Mirror. I don't know if anyone else here watches it, right? It's sort of a slightly dystopian or maybe very dystopian view of the future. And if you ask me, the one version of the future is the Facebook future, okay? And this is where, as nation states shrink and you know, suffer and fail to collect taxes and things like that, you have large private companies like Facebook that can fill in the gaps. And if Mark and his shareholders have their way, you know, we're all going to live in beautiful Facebook villages with houses painted blue, and we're going to, you know, have all of our conversations on Facebook, and we're going to vote on Facebook, and that would make them very happy. That's not only one possible version of the future. I think if you sort of continue down the current path that we're on, if you extrapolate based on current trends, that's where we're most likely to end up, is a Facebook version of the future. There's a lot of sci-fi authors, you know, going back to books like Snow Crash that have kind of articulated some version of like the privatization of everything. So the question I want to ask is, if this is not the future we want, first of all, is this the future you want, right? And I'm going to be bold and assume I know the answer for most of the people in this room. If it's not the future we want, how do we fight back? What do we have to our advantage that lets us build a better future? And I believe the way you do that is by exploiting asymmetries. Okay, so what tools, what power do we have that the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas of the world don't have and can't use? And among them, to me, the most powerful one is community and ownership. To me, community and ownership go hand in hand. Let me try to explain. There's a cognitive bias called the Endowment Effect, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, right? And the endowment effect is very real and very powerful, and it says that if you possess something, something that you feel you have an ownership over, you ascribe an enormous amount, actually an irrational amount of value to that thing, way more than you would pay for it if you were to walk into a store. There's a powerful difference between Facebook and Ethereum, right? I am not enfranchised by Facebook. Even if I buy Facebook stock, even if I work for Facebook, I still feel like a tiny little piece in a huge machine, and that machine is not responsive, it's not answerable to my concerns. I have no say in its governance, for example, right? And no ownership over the content. Ethereum is very different, right? Due to the nature of Ethereum, the fact that it's this open, permissionless commons, any random person like me, I was a complete nobody a year ago, you know, sitting in this audience watching these awesome talks, anyone can come in and assert themselves and have a huge role to play and really feel quite a strong sense of ownership over the platform. And I believe that that's something that we have that the Facebooks of the world can never have. And it's even more, right? We also have this secret power, this magic power, which is the fork, okay? And what that means is that any subset of us in this room, any group of people, if we ever feel that Ethereum is failing us, that it's not optimal, that it's not serving our needs, we have the power of exit, we have the power of fork, right? We can take it and we can install better governance, we can create a different version of it. And that's a very, very, very powerful idea. We don't even, it's not even that we have to follow through and do that, right? We haven't had many forks in Ethereum, but it's just the fact that that exists keeps everybody honest. In Facebook, I can't even like change a button, right? I can't like change the size or shape of something. I can't change the color. I can't change anything. I can't touch the data, right? Ethereum is the exact opposite. It's kind of this open network, and I believe that that is what sets us apart. As for like a specific vision and kind of like how we actually build this, what it would look like, there's a gentleman named Durand Line, who's I think one of the most brilliant thinkers in the world today, and writers as well. So he's written several books. This one, Who Owns the Future? It's a relatively quick read. I couldn't recommend it more highly. He articulates a very clear, very specific vision of what he calls a humanist information economy, which is how we like reinvent the concept of a social network, of a network in general. And of course, there is a lot of overlap with what we're doing with something like Ethereum. In a nutshell, what he describes is that the topology of these networks, of these value networks, needs to change, right? The way that the networks look right now is that they're very hierarchical, like a directed acyclic graph with a single root node at the top. And that root node could be Apple in the App Store, it could be Facebook, it could be, you know, Amazon, Google, et cetera. It's monopolistic, and all the value created in that network flows to the top because that's the only way for value to move from one point to another point. In Lanier's version of the future, we have much more decentralized peer-to-peer style networks where people are rewarded for creating and curating good content in the network. So I think that's one very concrete vision of like what we should be working towards. Ethereum is sort of many things to many people, right? It's a decentralized global computer, it's a state machine. My favorite version of Ethereum, if you zoom out to the very highest level of abstraction, is an operating system for building better human institutions. Fairer, more inclusive, more just, censorship resistant, right? Pick your favorite adjective. Institutions. I think that institutions are at the center of what we need to do, and it's the way that we build a better world. And I think that we have the tools in Web3 to do that. Let me give you a very concrete example. I'm a big fan of MakerDAO, and as the placeholder team here has pointed out, it's a better institution, right? So loans are not new. For anyone who may be unfamiliar, MakerDAO is a purely decentralized platform where you can lock up Ether and soon other types of collateral as well and receive a loan in a token called DAI. Loans are not new, right? Loans have existed for hundreds, probably thousands of years. You can go to the bank, any loan originator, and take out a loan. But Maker does it better in a few dimensions, right? So there's these two things called principal-agent problems, which are kind of information asymmetries. One is the fact that the balance sheet of a bank is private, right? We can't easily audit it and see, like, oh, how much collateral do they have on the books, okay? Another one is incentives, right? So as we saw very clearly in the financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009, a lot of bankers who made very poor decisions, who didn't govern their networks very well, were able to walk away with billions of dollars in bonuses, right? Maker fixes this too. The governors of the system, the holders of the governance token, are directly penalized if the system is under collateralized. And there's no way to avoid that. And on top of all that, it's not just better, it's also cheaper, right? It costs something like a fifth to a tenth of what it costs to take out a loan from a traditional bank, okay? So this is one type of institution. This is sort of a financial institution, but I think it's really an exemplar of what we can accomplish with a platform like Ethereum. This was never possible before. How many of you here are familiar with Paralelní Polnost or have been there before? This space is in Prague. I think they just opened a second one in Bratislava. We visited at DevCon last year. It's awesome. You can buy coffee with Bitcoin, which actually is kind of a big deal. There's a hacker space, co-working space there. What struck me about it is actually the name. Okay, Paralelní Polnost means parallel society. And to me, this is my vision of what we should be building, what we should be doing. Okay, the fact that Maker exists doesn't mean that we need to destroy the Federal Reserve or JP Morgan. Right? We're building a better system and better institutions in parallel to the ones that exist today, okay? And if we do that, if we get it right, people will see it and they will join these institutions, they will join these networks. And if we don't manage to do that, if people are not joining, then we're not doing it right, okay? And I would go so far as to say that if we try instead to destroy and tear down the existing system, then we're no better than the people or the institutions that we're trying to be better than, that we're trying to replace. And so that's why one of my favorite phrases is evolution, not revolution. So this ecosystem of institutions has begun to emerge in Ethereum, right? Maker's a great example. We have digital self-sovereign identity. We have censorship-resistant self-sovereign money. We have sort of legal contracts, right? I said identity already, property registers, non-fungible tokens. This is the very beginning, okay? But what we need to be doing is letting this experimentation happen, right? We need to be building, which we are, right? We need to continue building these new ideas, these new institutions, these new platforms, throw them out there into the world and kind of see what works and what doesn't work. And you know, as I said, right, we just need to build better things in parallel and trust that people will sort of see that and figure out and join us. What other type of institutions can we build? Well, so I talked about identity, I talked about, you know, legal stuff, governance, things like that. Could we even build physical infrastructure? So this is the Blockchains LLC project. They have some absurdly large amount of land in the Nevada desert, 50,000 acres or something. This project was unveiled at DevCon as well. And you know, I think a lot of people in this room are probably very skeptical about this project. I'm certainly skeptical about it, but I do think that this is the right level of ambition. Okay, we should have these big, hairy ambitions to build these crazy things, right? So they're building things like schools and hospitals completely on the blockchain. So I really think the sky's the limit. I really think that there's no limit to what we can build in parallel, an experimentation that we can and should be running. So moving into a conclusion here, we keep building, and as the present system begins to collapse and fall apart, when and if that happens, right, we will be ready. Right? We will have money, we will have identity, we will have governance, we will have services, all these things that are online and available and hopefully usable, so that when that time comes, we'll be there to offer an alternative. That, again, may sound kind of crazy, kind of ambitious, but I just want to explain, right, that there is precedent for things like this happening on at least on a smaller scale. So how many of you in this room are old enough to remember this? Have any of you guys ever used one of these before? Okay, a few hands, good. This is slightly before my time. Okay, this is a modem. So this is how all the computers in the world communicated and connected to the internet all through the 1980s, maybe even into the early 1990s. And at the time, the brightest minds in the world looked at this fledgling internet and they said, there's no way this will ever work, right? There's no way you can run something as big and ambitious as the internet over plain old telephone service. right? It wasn't designed to do that. It can't handle it. It's too slow. It's too clumsy. It's not usable. Do those adjectives sound familiar to us? I call this a failure of imagination, to kind of see the future and see what's possible. So, you know, fast forward 20, 30 years, right? And we're now in a world where it's no longer the internet running over the phone, okay? We now have the phone running over the internet, okay? There's a name for this phenomenon. It's called inversion. It's happened before, and it will happen again. And you know, the systems that we're building today, whether it's finance, whether it's identity, Ethereum, right? They are circumscribed by the furniture, right? They're circumscribed by the existing institutions. We have to obey the law. You know, Ethereum runs over the internet, et cetera. But if you are not able to kind of really zoom out and see a possible future where things get turned around, right? And where someday the internet runs on Ethereum, or where the institutions we've discussed, to the extent that they still exist and still function, are built on top of Web3, then I would say that that's a failure of imagination. Cool. So if any of this is interesting to you, please check out Etherion.org. There's a forum there where we've already got threads on a lot of these topics. We'll continue that conversation. I'm writing a book, which I'm also sharing a lot of ideas and content and outlines and things on Etherion.org, a book intended to talk about a lot of these themes and topics. So please join that conversation as well. We have a small meetup tomorrow night. There's a very limited number of spots, but if you're interested, there's a kickback site where you can sign up. So if you go to kickback.events, you'll see it. Also, if you go to Etherion.org, there's a link posted there. So I hope to see you guys join the conversation there. And I think that's all I've got, so thank you very much. Do we have any time left, or is that it? I think we have time for a couple of questions, so if anyone has any questions, let me know.
Great talk. Can you hear me? Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Closer. Okay. Great talk. So one of the things that, like, if you read up on sort of political theory or revolutionary theory, is this whole sort of dichotomy between can there be like this peaceful transition, or do you need revolution to have change? And sort of a lot of it concludes that you kind of need to have revolution. You can't really stop that. Although I guess the internet, as an example, is a case where there wasn't really a lot of conflict, it just sort of happened. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, like, you know, the nation state hasn't really come for the blockchain community yet, in any serious way, but it feels like it is inevitable. So what do we do then?
So to restate the question, it was kind of, there's a big topic in political theory, which is like, can we have big change in a peaceable way, kind of without revolution, or is revolution kind of inevitable? Is it necessary? A couple of thoughts, right? The first thought is we have maybe two things that never existed before in human history, okay? Two like total asymmetries. The first one is all of these political polities, all these states, all these territories, by definition in the past have always had to fight over land, which is scarce. It's a rivalrous good, okay? We're in a digital world, and so you can be part of multiple of these communities or territories at the same time. They're not rivalrous, okay? So I think that's a big difference. I think the only reason that we can build institutions in parallel without tearing down the existing ones is because we're not fighting over land, okay? So that's the first thought. Also, what did I want to say? Yeah, so you also made the point that like, we haven't yet seen much conflict between like blockchains and existing institutions. Is that inevitable? You know, if you believe that this transition that humanity is going through, right, from the information age into the digital, from the industrial age into the kind of digital information age, right? If you believe that that's as big a shift as I do, right, that humanity's only undergone a very small number of these transitions before, like moving from agriculture to industry, then that does suggest that we're in for a lot of conflict, right? Because those transitions, those massive transitions, have never been peaceful in the past. So I guess that's kind of two sides of the coin. I don't know the answer to the question, but it's a fascinating question. Maybe one more question. Any other questions? In the back? Vinay, how are you? Hey. Isn't this just classical anarchism? Classical? Again, I'm not a political theorist, okay? So I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what anarchism is or should be or what classical anarchism is. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But my short answer, my gut reaction is no, because we're not trying to just tear things down. We're trying to kind of be constructive and build newer and better things. So the fact that we want institutions in the first place, better ones, is not anarchy to me. All right, I'm tired. I'm going to sit down. Thank you very much for listening.